From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to the Sculptor's Funeral. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sculptor's Funeral. I'm your host, Jason Arkles, casting my pod from beautiful Florence, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. And today, we're going to talk about clay. Yes, clay. Everything about that wonderful, malleable gunk. I'm going to be speaking only of water-based clay today, so if you're into the oil clay, sit tight and we'll do an oil clay podcast down the line. But today, it's all about the natural stuff. So, how often do we sculptors hear painters talking like alchemists to each other when discussing the materials? Right? The chemical composition of their paints, the manipulation of their mediums by adding dryers or plasticizers, or seemingly arcane practices like thickening special oils in lead trays, letting it sit in the sun, stirring twice a day for 3 months. Or maybe we hear them talking about the merits of using glues made from rabbit skin over more modern glues to size their canvases. And of course the canvases themselves. Is it fine Belgian linen? Is it pre-sized? Painters' shop talk about their basic materials, at least to a sculptor, can seem endless. Now contrast that to the same sort of conversation between two sculptors. Ask a sculptor what kind of clay he or she uses, and the answer is generally either, oil-based clay or water-based clay. And there, the conversation stops. Press a sculptor to be more specific about his clay, and he might tell you what color it is, whether or not it's grogged, and maybe where he bought it. I mean, what else is there to know, right? We sculptors seem to know very little about our primary medium. The real alchemists of our medium are the ceramicists and the potters, who understand their clays thoroughly and know how to manipulate its properties to arrive at the perfect material for their particular use. You, the sculptor, might be wondering why you would need to know more than you do about clay. It doesn't seem to slow you down, right? How could clay be improved upon anyway, for use to the sculptor modeling a figure from life? Well, if you are wondering this, you've probably have never actually touched sculptor's clay before, because the fact is, most commercially available clay is formulated for potters, not sculptors. It's been formulated for throwing on a wheel and for firing in a kiln. It's been optimized for potters, which may or may not be optimal for those of us who are hand-building forms over an armature with no intention of firing. Now think about every type of problem you have with clay. The small freestanding bits like hands out in space, they dry much quicker than the rest of the work. Maybe the figure's ankles tend to crack in your work. Your surfaces become grainy with too much sponging. The clay can't support its own weight as much as you would like, which leads you to building these armatures that might be a little bit overbuilt and constrictive, at least if you don't want the larger, heavier parts of your sculpture to sag. In keeping the work moist over a period of time, maybe some parts of your sculpture turn to slush, sometimes overnight without warning. Well, a lot of these issues and problems can be eradicated, or at least mitigated, by knowing more about your medium and having the means to alter your medium's composition. So let's talk clay. Now, most of the information I'm going to give today on clay comes from a book called The Potter's Dictionary of Materials and Techniques by Frank Hamer. It's huge, it's exhaustive. I mean, it's more like an encyclopedia. And I recommend it to anyone who wants to know all there is about clay, especially if you're interested in firing your work, because it is geared towards potters. The articles go into about as much depth as is possible, right down to the molecular level, about everything involved in clay and the firing process. So let's start at the beginning. What is clay, and where does it come from? Well, clay begins its life, as most mineral compositions do, deep under the Earth's crust. Molten magma pushes up through the Earth's crust to form various forms of igneous or metamorphic rock. And on its way up, though, the magma can mix with minerals and gases already present in the crust, which leads to the creation of different types of rock. Sometimes those different minerals and gases, like fluorine, boron, and carbon dioxide, help to produce a weak form of granite, which soon decomposes into other minerals, and this allows some granites to eventually decompose into what we call clay. Now, clay is different everywhere. It all depends on the various minerals that are present in the environment that gets mixed into the base clay. So when you buy clay off the shelf, basically it's been broken down into its base components and then recombined into a uniform mixture of ingredients. But when clay occurs naturally, it's different absolutely everywhere. But at its purest state, clay is nothing more or less than hydrated silicate of aluminum. It's a mineral with a crystalline structure. This mineral kind of looks like a flat hexagon, kind of like a disc shape. Now these crystals are really, really small, too small to see, but they group together into particles, which we can see, at least bigger particles. Particles come in different sizes, and you can sift the different sizes out, or you can grind them down, and a lot of times, actually, nature itself does the sifting and grinding. Now, in nature, we find two basic types of clay. We find primary clay and secondary clay. Now, primary clay is clay that didn't travel after it was born. Like, imagine the granite decomposing into clay on a plain, or maybe at the bottom of a depression, like a basin or a dry lake bed, right? Wind and rain doesn't wash it away to anywhere, so it stays put right where it disintegrated into clay. Now, primary clays are usually made of large particles. It's a very pure kind of clay. Often it's white, which is actually the natural color of hydrated silicate of aluminum. And this primary clay group includes things like china clays and porcelain, and also bentonite. Now, secondary clay, it's the same sort of thing. It's the same exact mineral, but it's traveled, right, after it was born. It was moved around by water or ice or wind, and because of all this action and movement, it gets ground finer. Additives get mixed in, different impurities from the surrounding environment, and eventually the clay settles in low areas like lakes and riverbeds. And the particles also settle according to size, right? The larger ones will end up on top, just like when you shake a bowl of popcorn and all the small pieces and unpopped pieces go to the bottom, and the large fluffy stuff is up on top. It's the same thing with clay. You'll get the large particles on top and the small particles on the bottom. Now, within these secondary clays, there are a lot of different types, which have undergone different environmental changes, like heat or pressure or weathering, or just have different compositions with all sorts of different minerals and impurities mixed in. And there are tons of types of secondary clays. The typical clay we sculptors buy from the pottery supply stores or the art supply stores, well, those clays are based on secondary clays. All of these clays can be separated into basically two basic groups, right? The red clays, which fire into what we call terracotta, or buff cream-colored clays, which can be white or gray or cream-colored or even brown. We're all familiar with the fired products of these two basic types, right? The red stuff, that's what we use for bricks and for flower pots. And white is the sort of general ceramics that you find used for coffee mugs, that sort of thing. Now, red clays are versatile, all-purpose clays. Bricks and flower pots, as I mentioned, are made out of red clays, and it's a good choice for architectural ceramics, and ceramics in general. I mean, they fire into a nice, tough product, even if it's a little porous. Now, some so-called red clays are actually different colors in their raw state. Like when you're using the clay, when you're manipulating it, it's a different color than red, right? So the color when you're working it is not the same as after you've fired it. It can usually be a rich brown, or a dark green, or even a blackish color, but nonetheless they fire into a red color. Now here in Florence, the standard clay many sculptors use off the shelf is actually a darkish green clay that nevertheless fires red. Now some yellow clays will also fire to a red, and so technically they're also called red clays. The red colors are generally from iron oxides present in the composition of the clay. Red clays are highly plastic with a fine grain size. Grain size, or in other words, particle size, is kind of important. Now, the smaller the particle, the more plastic the clay will be. Red clays can be blended together to create different clays with different properties. Buff clays, sometimes called creamware, are actually blended from a mix of china clay. Remember the first group of clay, the primary clays with the large particles? It's a mixture of a primary clay and then a ball clay. And what is a ball clay? Well, a ball clay is just another type of secondary clay. It's light in color, like china clay, but unlike china clay, it has a very small particle size. It's kind of at the other end of the spectrum from China clay with its large particles. So China clay is coarse and not plastic enough, and ball clay with its fine particles is kind of too plastic and too slippery. But when you combine them together, you get a very workable clay called, in general, creamware. Ball clay, by the way, is called ball clay because, in general, it's dug out of the ground in clay pits. And when it was extracted in the old days, it was done in sort of easy-to-carry 25-pound pieces, and these were called balls. Some ball clay is known as blue clay or black clay due to the presence of carbon in the composition. So if red clay is the great all-purpose clay, creamware is the basic clay body with which we develop specific clays for specific uses. Creamwares are the basis of the household ceramics industry. Think plates and mugs. Anything ceramic you get at IKEA is going to be made of probably creamware. Go to your kitchen and grab a chipped coffee mug or a plate. Where that glaze is chipped off, the material inside will likely be sort of a creamy yellow, right? Now, creamwares are sort of new on the scene. They were developed at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England at the beginning of the 18th century. In fact, many of the ceramic processes we may be familiar with today were only invented or perfected in the 1700s, and was one of the foundations of the Industrial Revolution, particularly in Britain. So which type of clay should sculptors use, red clay or creamware? Well, both are fine. Obviously, the red clays were good enough for the sculptors of the Renaissance, right through the Baroque and up to the Neoclassical era, so they're good enough for you. Creamware clays did, however, become popular with sculptors as soon as it became available. Many fired clay preparatory sketches exist from the 18th century from the likes of great sculptors like Canova, Thorvaldsen, and many others. The improved workability was an attraction, as well as a fired product that more closely resembled white marble, which must have appealed to neoclassical tastes that Canova and Thorvaldsen shared. But for figurative sculptors working from life, where your visual input is of paramount importance, the creamware clays have another distinct advantage. Here's a quote from an English text from 1880. It's a book called Instructions on the Art of Modeling in Clay by Ambrose Louis Vago. Clay of the lightest color is preferable, as dark clays obscure the shadows by which form is, to a certain extent, rendered distinguishable. Now, what Vago is referring to when he talks about dark clay obscuring shadows, that's the phenomenon of tonal value, right? So on a light surface, any sort of light surface, the contrast between a part of that surface in full light and a part of that surface in shadow, the contrast between those two, they're greater than the contrast would be on a darker surface, right? Because of this higher contrast, your eye will be able to detect more subtle gradations of shadow over the surface of a form. In essence, you will see in a more subtle way the directional flow of surface planes when using a light clay than when you're using a darker one. Also, I find that to get a clear visual image of a form in outline, the best thing to do is to use a backdrop, right? A nice solid tone, some sort of curtain or drape behind my work and behind my model. Now, for contrast, a dark background cloth can be used with a lighter clay. But if you're using a darker clay, you might want to go with a lighter backdrop to get the contrast. But this is kind of a bad idea, because if your field of vision contains mostly a white backdrop, your pupils will actually close up a bit. They'll close up a bit more than they would with a darker backdrop. And your smaller pupils reduce your ability to distinguish tonal values. It's like a very, very mild version of snow blindness. So, for your clay, if all other considerations are equal in terms of strength and plasticity, go with the lighter colored clay. Okay, now that we know a little bit about the basic types of clay and what the various colors mean, let's move on to talk about the properties of clay that are directly relevant to clay modelers. Now, the two properties which concern us clay modelers are plasticity and strength. Now, let's talk about plasticity first. I mentioned that the larger clay particles are less plastic than small clay particles, but what exactly is this property called plasticity anyway? What does it mean to be plastic? Plasticity is the property of a material to have the strength of a solid with the fluidity of a liquid. Right? The solid clay can be reformed without breaking it apart and putting it back together again. Think of a potter at a potter's wheel. What does she do? She puts a single lump of clay in the center and skillfully applies pressure on that lump in various ways until the form of a vase appears. Right? She arrived at this form only by applying pressure. She didn't add bits of clay. She didn't take clay away. It's that same lump of clay pushed and pulled into a completely different form than when she began. If you want to change the shape of a non-plastic material, you have to add or subtract material. That's the difference, right? If you're making a wooden vase, you don't push on the piece of wood until it looks like a vase. You take material away, or you could even add it on until it looks like a vase. So that's the difference between plastic and non-plastic material. It's also important to note that when you move one part of a clay body, as a potter's hand does when applying pressure, the clay doesn't revert back to its original form when the pressure is taken away. In other words, clay is plastic, but it's not elastic. It doesn't stretch, it doesn't bounce back. It moves into a new place and it stays there, taking a new shape. The more radically you can alter the shape of a piece of clay without it tearing or breaking, the more plastic it is. A common test for plasticity is to take some clay and roll out a little snake or a worm, and then tie that snake into a simple knot. Now, if the clay starts to tear at the more radical bends in the knot, it's not as plastic as another piece of clay that does not tear when bent into a similar shape. So that's plasticity. It's pretty easy to grasp. But at the same time, it's kind of a difficult property to measure. In fact, there is no standard measurement or standard for plasticity. A material is only referred to as being more or less plastic. I mean, we can't rate it a 4 out of 10 on the plastic scale or anything like that. And this is because so many factors contribute to the phenomenon of plasticity. The plasticity of clay is constantly changing its properties. Right? We know this, of course. As a piece of clay we hold in our hands for 10 minutes will become a little drier and therefore less plastic than it was 10 minutes before. So the property of plasticity isn't a constantly inherent attribute to clay, as clay is constantly undergoing processes like drying that affect plasticity. The plasticity of clay is all about the ability of each clay particle to slide past its neighbor. That's what's going on at a molecular level when you're manipulating a plastic material. So when nothing is acting on clay, it's stable and it doesn't move. But by applying pressure, either with your fingers or with a tool or even the action of gravity, you reach a pressure point where the clay starts to move, right? You apply a little bit of pressure, it doesn't do anything, then you stick your thumb into it a little bit harder and it starts to deform. Now this point, this pressure point where clay starts to move, this is known as the yield point. Now the higher the yield point, the stronger the clay is said to be. So strength is a combination of the inherent friction in clay particles and the molecular bonds between the clay particles themselves. The stronger the friction and the stronger the bonds, the stronger the clay. It's important to note that strength is not the opposite of plasticity, right? Strength is just the amount of force you need to move the clay past its yield point. You can have a very strong and very plastic clay, or you can have a very weak and very plastic clay. Okay, at this point, we need to use our imagination and visualize a model of the particle structure of clay. So bear with me a little bit. Everyone, close your eyes. Now I want you to imagine a large table, a large dining room table. And on this large table, there are dinner plates, but not just where people will sit and eat from them, but entirely covering the surface of the table. Every plate actually touching their neighbors. So like 50 plates covering the entire surface. Now these are clay particles. Remember I said they were kind of in the shape of discs? Now, on these plates, you're going to dump a load of tennis balls so that the tennis balls completely cover the plates and are touching each other, right? Like a couple hundred tennis balls, right? So maybe like 7 or 8 different tennis balls on a plate. Now these are water molecules. Got that? So you got a layer of plates, then a layer of balls. Now once you got that, you're going to stack another layer of plates on top of the tennis balls. And then add another layer of tennis balls on top of those plates, and so on and so on. It's not exactly what a clay particle looks like, but it's good enough to use as a mental model of clay. Plates and tennis balls are like clay particles and water molecules. Now lastly, I want you to imagine that the plates are magnets, and that each plate is attracting every other plate near it. So everything is locked together pretty well. It doesn't move that well. It's not actually magnetism that locks these plates together. It's a different kind of bond, but we'll use the idea of magnetism as a stand-in for the natural molecular bonding that occurs between the clay particles for now. So imagine this crazy tower of magnetized plates and balls that you just built. Now, start to push on one side of that tower. The layers of plates start to roll past each other, sliding along on the balls. And it's just as if you push or bend clay. The particle layers all slide past each other, riding on layers of water, breaking molecular bonds with the plate below it as they form new bonds with the next plate it comes close to. Right? And when you stop pushing, the plates keep the bonds they currently have with their neighbors, and everything stays in place, even though it's a new shape. Right? So we can bend and deform this stack of plates and balls as long as we don't get too forceful or extreme with our bending and pushing. The stack will stay together in one piece, even though it takes different shapes. That's how plasticity works. Now, with this same imaginary model, we can now instantly understand why clay gets hard and shrinks when it dries, right? So imagine your clay tower, your plate and ball tower. Now start taking away balls. The stack of plates starts to get a little bit smaller, right? The plates get closer together. You take away all the balls, and now you have a bunch of magnetized plates that are now locked into position with each other. It's just like the molecular bonding that takes place between clay particles, which will be stronger without water getting in the way. And that's why dry clay is inflexible. And now imagine one half of the stack with the regular amount of balls, but the other half being devoid of balls altogether. Now the half with no balls, that half of the stack is going to be much smaller and lower, right? And so the top layer of plates on the no ball side, it loses the bond with the top layer of plates on the other side, which is much taller and larger. And this is what happens when one section of clay dries out and shrinks more quickly than another section of clay. The clay pulls itself apart, and that causes a crack. Our mental model also helps us to understand how clay sticks together when we add one piece of clay to another. So instead of your hand applying force to our stack of plates and balls, just imagine another stack of plates and balls being pushed into the first stack, right? You've got two stacks, you're going to try to combine them. Now, as they collide, they both deform, and some plates and balls from one piece form bonds with plates and balls from the other piece. They then essentially become one piece. Now, we know that the drier the clay is, the harder we have to work to get those two pieces of clay to become one. And this isn't because drier clay particles have weaker bonds. In fact, some types of bonds are stronger because the particles are closer together, without the water getting in the way. It's because suction bonds of wet clay are very strong compared to other types of bonds, and for suction you need water. How water works in clay is really interesting. Basically, water flows right through clay pretty easily, and we know that, right? If you let a big piece of clay dry out, the part that dries out last is going to be on the bottom, because as water sort of evaporates from the surface of the clay, any water from a higher spot will flow through the clay to take the place of any lost water below it, right? Just through gravity. And if you put a piece of clay on a table and then press it down, even for a second, it'll leave a little watermark on the table, right? Because you just pressed water right out of the clay. It moves that easily. If you hold clay in your hand for 10 minutes, you know that it soon becomes tough and stiff because your hand has actually absorbed water right from the clay. And working with clay for a long time will leave our hands feeling dry, right? Because the clay can also pull moisture right from your hand. It's a very, very permeable substance. So when we model our figures in clay, it's best to have a slightly drier figure and use slightly wetter clay to add to the figure. Wet over dry, right? We know this. Working in this way, the drier clay sucks some moisture from the new piece of clay you just put on, encouraging suction and molecular bonds and making the clay stick. If both pieces of clay are just a little too dry, you're going to have a harder time getting them to fuse and to blend. And that's why we wet down a clay surface if we're going to attach a big piece of clay to it, right? It's not that water is sticky. Water isn't like glue. Water is watery. But water facilitates bonding through suction. Now, I don't think you sculptors are hearing anything new when I say water content affects plasticity. But what other factors affect plasticity in clay? Well, I mentioned clay particle size, right? And the uniformity of particle size is important as well. So smaller particles equals more plasticity. And a uniform size also means more plasticity. Remember our group of red clays, right? They occur naturally as a secondary clay, which settles in places like riverbeds and sorts themselves out according to size. If you harvest clay from the same strata of that riverbed, you're going to get a consistent particle size and therefore a more plastic clay. But creamware, remember, the buff-colored clay, that's made out of large particled china clay and fine particled ball clays. Now, they're generally a little less plastic than red clays, if all other factors are equal. I know some sculptors who prefer to work with the darker red clays here in Florence than with the lighter creamware for exactly this reason. They like the plasticity of the red clay. It's an easier clay to work with because the high plasticity gives a broader range to the clay, basically the range between unworkably wet to unworkably dry. The creamware clay that we get around here, at least, it seems to have a higher water content to make up for the clay's lower inherent plasticity, but that higher content makes the clay slightly weaker. So particle size indeed is a consideration. Now another component of plasticity is the ratio of clay to non-clay additives. Right? So all clay, as I said, is hydrated silicate of alumina. But there are tons of different kinds of clays, and the differences mainly lie in what else is mixed in with the clay. Now the more obvious impurities in clay are the ones that affect color, like iron in red clays or carbon in blue clays. But there are many other things you can stick into clay to change its properties of workability. And the most common one is called grog. Grog is a ceramic material like fired clay or even just silica sand that's been more or less finely ground and then mixed in with the clay. Now, almost all clays we buy contain grog. Many clays contain very finely ground grog, so we don't usually even notice it until we maybe over-sponge a surface and wash away all the ball clay, leaving a grainy texture. Other clays have a large-grained grog, which is what gives the clay a grainy look and feel. It's impossible to get a smooth surface in a heavily grogged clay, so a lot of sculptors avoid it for that reason, unless the specific texture of grogged clay is desired. So why is it there in the first place? Well, grog is what is known to ceramicists as an opener. It opens the clay. It makes the clay more porous on a very small scale. Now, to imagine what's going on with opening a clay, go back to your mental picture of the plates and balls. Now, imagine in your stack of plates and tennis balls, a few basketballs are thrown in randomly. Now, this disrupts the uniform layers of clay and causes gaps to form in the structure. And as you might imagine, this decreases plasticity. But the advantages are that these disruptions allow for water to flow through the clay structure much more easily. For a potter, this means their work dries more evenly, which alleviates the possibility of cracking. Interestingly, we can see the same principle of an opener applied on a large scale. The difference between cement and concrete is that concrete is basically just cement with gravel mixed in, and this prevents the material from cracking in the same way that grog prevents clay from cracking. And that's why you use concrete for paving roads and pouring house foundations, and cement is used in thin amounts to bond brick and stone. You can't really use cement in a large mass without it cracking, unless you add an opener like gravel. Now, grog also reduces shrinking when the clay dries, right? These little bits of grog in your clay, they don't really interact with water, and so there is a lower water-to-particle ratio in the clay, meaning there's less water to lose during drying, and therefore less shrinkage overall. Grogged clay will also generally feel drier to the touch because of this, and it's also lighter by volume because this lower water-to-particle ratio. Also, when clay is fired, the clay particles themselves actually shrink during the firing process. But because grog is made up of already fired ceramic material, it's kind of pre-shrunk, meaning the overall clay body will shrink a little bit less during the firing if there is grog present. Finally, because of all these properties that grog introduces to clay, the open porousness, the reduced plasticity, the drier and lighter nature of the clay, it all makes it the clay of choice for large, heavy work that is meant to be fired. Remember, clay that is fired cannot have an armature, and the body of the work shouldn't be too thick either, so what is needed is a light, strong clay that won't deform easily. This is a perfect example where a low plasticity is a good quality to have in clay for modeling. Yet another important factor of plasticity is one I've mentioned throughout the podcast but haven't really fully explained, and that is particle bonding. Now, up until now, I've been using magnetism to illustrate this bonding action in our mental model of plates and balls, but that's not an entirely accurate metaphor. First off, there's more than one type of particle bond. One is molecular, which locks particles together, either with themselves or with other particles such as water particles or additives in the clay like grog. But another is static charge, which is strong or weak according to the proximity of particles. Now, I've already mentioned friction and suction. All these types of bonds both create strength and can contribute to higher plasticity. Now, about the molecular force of attraction between clay particles, it's actually pretty weak, and it's easily overcome, but it is there. Part of it is gravitational force, and part of it is called van der Waals force, if you care to know. But what you really need to know is that this attractive force is there, because we can actually watch this force of attraction in action. Have you ever mixed up some slip, a clay and water solution used to glue clay together? You mix it up in a cup or a bowl, and it's thick, or at least very cloudy. But if you let it sit, it starts to separate into clay at the bottom of the cup and water at the top, right? What's happening in that slip is a condition of clay where all the particles are floating free in suspension of water. And they would stay this way if it weren't for attractive forces at work. As one particle bumps into another, they stick together because of this van der Waals molecular bond, and the new larger particle will now attract other larger particles, and soon the clay particle is big enough and heavy enough to the point where gravity pulls it down to settle into the bottom of your slip bucket. Right? This action of particles coming together in a solution like that is called flocking. It's not spelled like flock of birds, it's spelled F-L-O-C. It's actually called flocculation. But it's easy to remember if you think of flocking like birds, right? They stick together. Now here's the cool part. Clay particles also have a repulsive force to them. It's an electrostatic charge, which is actually a lot like our magnet metaphor. But clay particles are shaped like a disc or a plate, right? So they don't have a positive end and a negative end. Instead, how they're charged is the flat center of the particle has a negative charge, and the edge of the particle, along the edge of the disc, has a positive charge. Now, this electrostatic charge is also very weak, which is why we can layer our clay structure with the edges of the plates touching, which should repel the particles, but the electrostatic charge is just no match for all the other attractive forces like suction, friction, van der Waals force, and all the rest. So flocculation is the attractive force, and electrostatic charge is the repulsive force. If all this seems like too much needless information for a figurative sculptor, bear with me. It becomes relevant when we want to take control of our clays and alter their properties. I'll be explaining how to do that in just a few minutes. So we now understand where clay comes from, what it's made of, and what determines its main characteristics of workability, which are plasticity and strength. The next thing to explore is what are its characteristics most favorable for figure modelers, and how do we arrive at those characteristics with our own clay? Well, we should start by taking note that potters, ceramicists, those throwing lumps of clay into pots and vases on a potter's wheel, they like to have a very high plasticity and a low to average strength. As I mentioned, throwing a pot is basically taking a single lump of clay and pushing, pulling, squeezing, and bending that lump into a pot shape. Figure modelers, on the other hand, create their work by adding and subtracting bits of clay to the work. Imagine if we were to make a figure the same way a potter makes a pot. That is, by starting with a lump of clay, the same volume as the final figure, and just pulling it into the shape of a figure. If we did that, we would also desire a similar high plasticity in our clay. But the fact is, we just don't need to have our clay be that plastic if we're building it up piece by piece, as most of us do. Likewise, potters like a fairly low strength of clay so that the clay yields under gentle pressure on the wheel. So when we buy potter's clay and use it for our figures, this clay needs to be well supported by an armature because it is plastic and fairly weak. If figure modelers had a stronger clay, our armatures might be more lightweight, flexible, and less intrusive than they generally are. So how do we get the clay of our dreams? The clay that stands on its own 2 feet, doesn't sag, doesn't crack, but is plastic enough to use? Well, the hard way would be to study ceramics a little bit more, buy a bunch of raw materials, and then come up with your own unique recipe. And someday I might do that. But there is a simpler way, and that is to experiment with and alter the store-bought potter's clay you're already using, to see how far you can tweak its existing properties to get it to do what you want. I will give the entire process of what I do to my clay, but keep in mind, clay is different all over the world, so using the same process as I do, it will yield the same results, but only if you're starting with the same kind of clay that I start with. So if you follow my process, it might require adjustments to get the same results, depending on the type of clay. So I start with a buff-colored creamware. It's a very light gray, produced right here in Tuscany. It's very lightly grogged, so it has a very smooth texture. I buy it in 25-kilo loaves, as they're called, and the first thing I do is I give it to my students to use for their works which will eventually be fired. Generally, these are portrait busts. These busts are modeled over an armature, so I'm not really worried about the potter's clay sagging. It's also new clay, so I'm not worried about impurities getting into the clay to interfere with firing, which can be a concern if you're using recycled clay to make something for firing. Now, when the students are done with their portraits, these portrait heads are cut off the armatures and hollowed out. Now, I save all the scraps of clay that the students hollow out of the heads, as well as any discarded but clean scraps of clay produced in the course of the class. I have a small bucket in the corner of the studio for that purpose. Any clay left on the turntables at the end of every class goes into the bucket. I then allow the scraps of clay to dry out completely. I mean completely. Completely dry clay is much easier to crush with a hammer than green clay. Greenware is the name potters give to clay that is done being worked and hard to the touch, but not completely dry. When you hit a big lump of green clay with a hammer, it tends to dent rather than shatter, and shattering is what we want. Now, I crush the dry clay into pieces no bigger than a golf ball at the largest. I actually go for a little bit smaller than that. And I always wear a dust mask when I do this. Now, dry clay has free silica in it, right? And that's going to become airborne. And habitual breathing of silica over the course of your career will give you silicosis. So anytime you're working with dry clay in a situation where it gets dusty, even if you're just sweeping your studio floor, you should wear a dust mask. Seriously. Because I'm not constantly recycling vast amounts of clay, I just use a large hammer to bust up the clay. But if I were a professional clay maker, I'd have a mill or a grinder to do it, and it'd be a little bit less effort. So I put the crushed clay into a 30-gallon rubber trash can, or if you're British, I put it into a 110-liter rubbish bin. Next, you add water. You want to add enough water so that the clay is completely covered, and maybe an inch or two of water on top of that. You'll see a bit of bubbling as air trapped in the clay rises, and you might even get a little bit of a scum forming. We're adding much more water than the clay needs in the consistency of the clay body, but a very wet clay is easier to manipulate during recycling, and we will be removing the extra water eventually. But wait! Before we add water, we're going to add something to the water. We're going to add white vinegar. Being in Italy, I use white wine vinegar because it's what they have at the grocery store, but cider vinegar works just as well. But why vinegar? Well, vinegar is an acid. Now, the acid adds a change to the water which counteracts the electrostatic charge between the clay particles. Remember I said that this particle bonding would become relevant? Well, here it is. We add the vinegar because the vinegar is a flocculant. It encourages particles to settle out of suspension. Now, why is this important? Well, remember that creamware, the kind of clay that I'm recycling, is made of big clay particles and small particles. Some are very small, and they can stay in suspension for a lot longer than the large particles, maybe days. But we don't want that. We want everything to settle at the same time, achieving a homogeneous settling rather than settling according to particle size. So we add about 1% vinegar to the total mass of clay and water. You can estimate, it doesn't need to be exact. I throw in about a cup of vinegar to every 40 liters of water I add to the dry clay. Now, every time you recycle clay, you're going to lose some of the proportion of the fine particles of ball clays, over time. It's just inevitable. We wash away some fine clay and leave the coarser clay every time we spray our figures to keep them moist or sponge their surface. If you ever sponged a clay surface too much, like I mentioned, and you're left with that gritty surface, that's because you washed most of the ball clay away. Anytime you touch something to clay and that thing is stained with a bit of clay, it's going to be the finer particles that dirty your hands or the bag you cover your sculpture with or the front of your shirt. However, up to a certain point, a little less ball clay in your clay is a good thing. If your clay is nicely plastic potter's clay like mine is. Over time and after repeated cycling of the clay loses a bit of plasticity but gains strength by the loss of a proportion of the ball clay. And higher strength is what I want. But after a lot of recycling, sometimes I start to feel like my clay has gone a little past what I like it to be in terms of plasticity. So I add a little ball clay into the mix when I add my water and my vinegar. I keep a bag of bentonite in dry powdered form handy for this. Now, bentonite is an extremely plastic clay body that almost feels greasy to the touch in powdered form. And in fact, it's actually used as a dry lubricant in certain industries. Now, you can get bentonite at any ceramic supply store as well as lots of other raw ingredients for clay if you want to experiment. Here's the thing about bentonite, though. It is a very, very effective deflocculant. This means it has the opposite effect of vinegar. It's an alkali that passes on positively charged ions to all the little negatively charged parts of your clay particles. And this means that the clay suspended in the water will not aggregate and sink to the bottom because all those positive charges repel each other. The particles will resist settling out of suspension. Now, this is very useful if you're trying to make a casting slip. I'll talk about casting slips in a later episode. But it's very annoying if you are just trying to recycle clay, right? Because if you add enough bentonite, your clay will stay in suspension practically forever. If you add too much, your clay will actually turn into a gel. It's very strange stuff. So if you add bentonite, use it sparingly. Add the vinegar as well, because that'll counteract the deflocculant properties of the bentonite. Now, bentonite also swells and sticks to itself when it's wet. So what you want to do is first you sort of carefully sprinkle the bentonite into a large quantity of water, give it a good stir, let it sit for a little bit, and then dump it into your clay bucket with your vinegar and your water, and then give it another good stir. Speaking of stirring, you don't want to stir your clay and water too much. Try to avoid putting your clay into suspension, right? Even if you have added the vinegar, you want to, keep it to a minimum. The only reasons to mix at all are if you're adding something like bentonite and you need to distribute it evenly throughout the bucket, or to sort of dig down into the clay and break up lumps of clay that the water is having a hard time penetrating. Now, I usually add the water and additives. I wait a day or two, just let the water work through the clay. Then I give it a quick stir with my hand to check for lumps, and then I wait another 2 days. You want to give the clay plenty of time to absorb the water and completely destroy the structure of the dried clay. You will notice that an hour after adding the water, instead of a bunch of pieces of clay under the water in your recycling bucket, what you're going to get is sort of a silt. A lot of the clay is already completely disintegrated into a silt. And it's strange. You go down and touch it, and it doesn't feel like clay anymore. It doesn't feel plastic at all. It feels like mud. It's interesting, isn't it? That wet clay can feel very plastic, then it dries and becomes hard, but then when you reintroduce water, it doesn't go back to feeling plastic, but feels like just mud. Now, what's going on with that? Well, remember that we have added a ton more water than is necessary, which means the clay particles can now swim around really, really freely with all this extra water. Remember the electrostatic charge of particles? It's like magnetism. Well, opposites attract, as we know. And so the positive charged edge of the disc-like clay particle is now free to move around a bit, and it'll naturally seek the negatively charged flat bit of another particle. So when that happens, instead of all the plates lying next to each other in nice layers like in our mental model, every clay particle is now standing at a right angle to the particles next to it, because you're getting the positive parts of the clay being attracted to the negative parts of other clay particles. Right? Instead of a layer structure, it's more like the structure of a house of cards. This structure destroys the clay's ability for plasticity. But don't worry about that, though. In the next steps of the process, we're going to restore both the layer structure and the plasticity to the clay. So next, after we've had the clay sitting in our water bucket for, close to a week, maybe more if you want, we're going to now dewater the clay. Dewatering. In other words, we're going to dry out the clay. And for that, you will need an absorbent surface to lay your mud-like clay out on for a day or two. Now, I've heard of people using a brick surface like a brick floor, but of course you're going to want to make sure that that surface is completely free of dirt and dust. But also, most indoor brick paving is sealed and waterproof, so that's no good because we want an absorbent surface. And so the best solution is to make yourself a plaster bat, which is what I do. Now, a plaster bat, and that's bat spelled with 2 T's, is just a big plaster slab. I made mine using an entire 25-kilo bag of plaster. It's about 5 inches thick, and the thicker the better, and it's about 18 inches wide and about 3 feet long. And it's very slightly concave on the top surface, a slight bowl to it. Now you want to make the inside of that bowl as smooth as possible. Basically what I did to make it, I just mixed up the plaster, I let it set to a nice sort of firm putty consistency, and then hand-shaped a bowl in about 5 minutes. Now when you make it, let it dry out for a few weeks before you use it. You really want to let all the extraneous moisture in the plaster evaporate. And when it's ready, the first thing you want to do is to make sure that your clay will not pick up plaster residue and dust when you use it. So for a brand new plaster bat, what you need to do first is spread a thin layer of your muddy clay from your recycling bucket over the entire surface of the bat. It'll take about a day, maybe 2, for that muddy clay to firm up to the point where you can sort of peel it right off. Now don't wait until the clay is completely dry. Rather, wait until the clay is plastic but a little firm, and you can sort of remove it in large pieces. When you remove the clay from the bat, you will see that the bottom of the clay has a lot of white staining from the plaster. This is exactly what you wanted to happen. The next time you use the bat, the clay will come away completely clean. Now be careful never to scratch the surface of the bat with your fingernails or a tool, because that scratch will probably allow dust and plaster particles to enter your clay the next time you use it. So, now that you have your plaster bat, you apply the clay muck right out of the bucket onto the bat. Make it an even thickness so it all dries at the same rate. I usually pile mine about 4 inches deep. And at that depth, with a dry bat, it'll take about a day and a half for the clay to sufficiently dewater. But of course it all depends on the temperature and the humidity of the room, the thickness of your plaster bat, how dry it was when you started, and of course the properties of your clay. So what you want to do is check on it several times a day until you can accurately predict how long the dewatering will take for you. So to check it, see if you can actually lift the edge of the clay mass cleanly away from the bat in one piece. The bat will absorb moisture really quickly, so the clay will dry on the bottom much more rapidly than on the top. So when enough moisture has been pulled out, you'll actually be able to just sort of flip the whole clay mass, even in one piece sometimes, but usually in several pieces. And then you flip it, like you're making an omelet, and that will dewater the top side of the clay. Now, if I start the dewatering process first thing in the morning, I can sometimes flip the clay that evening, or if not, first thing the next morning. Again, your results may vary. As the clay dewaters, you will feel some of the plasticity return to the clay, and this is because the extra water in your mix was getting in the way of the clay particles to where they could not settle down and lie flat. Gravity and weight apply more force to make them lie flat than their electrostatic charge makes them want to stack like a house of cards. So when they're not floating around in a lot of water, they tend to lie flat. We're going to give them a lot more encouragement in doing this, though, through a process called wedging and kneading. Now, wedging is basically taking one piece of clay, slamming it down onto another piece of clay. This action blends and mixes the clay, because you're going to find that your dewatered clay is going to have some soft wet spots and some drier spots, and we want to get a uniformity going. Wedging also compresses the clay. That is, it encourages the clay particles to lie down in the most compact pattern it can arrange itself into. It also pushes any air bubbles out of the clay. Now, the first thing you need to wedge clay is a surface to do it on. A good sturdy table is a must. Also, this surface should be covered with a material like light canvas, and here's why. Have you ever rolled out a piece of clay on a wooden or a marble tabletop? The clay ends up sticking to the table, right? If the table is covered with canvas, the canvas wicks away the moisture that leaves the clay when you slam it down, and the clay doesn't end up sticking to the table because of suction. I have several surfaces in my studio covered with canvas, so I have a convenient place to roll out my clay for clay walls when I make molds, for example, or even just a place to set a lump of clay I'm using. So you got your sturdy, canvas-covered table, and you have your dewatered clay. Now, how do you know your clay is ready? Well, take a good double handful of it and put it on the table. Fold it and knead it like dough a couple times, and if your hands are covered with muck when you do this, and the clay smears across the surface of the canvas, then your clay is not sufficiently dewatered. If there's just a little sticky muck on your hands, and it seems to come away from the canvas fairly cleanly, then it's good. But if your hands come away fairly dry, and folding it is quite tough, and maybe the clay cracks a little bit when it folds, then it might be too late. You might be able to save it by soaking it in water for a few hours, but frankly, I just let it dry out, I crush it, and I recycle it again. It's better to err on the side of the clay being a little too moist than too dry. Wetter clay is easier, if a little messier, to wedge and to knead, and the clay is going to dry out a little bit as the canvas soaks up moisture from it anyway. Further, if you don't have immediate plans to use the clay, having it on the softer side in storage is a great idea, as it only takes a little bit of airing it out on the day of use to get it back to the right water content. So, back to wedging. Here's what you do. Take a good double handful of clay from the bat. Slam it down with a little force. Don't go crazy on it or anything, just enough force to flatten the bottom and compress the clay. If clay spatters everywhere, it's definitely too wet. Then, take a wire cutter, cut the lump in half, then take the near half of the clay lump into your hands, turn it over, and slam it down onto the other half. And then repeat this action 50 times. Cut, turn, slam. Now, wedging sounds like a lot of work. It is. And the amount of wedging you need to do with your clay really depends on the condition of clay in the first place. Now, if you're making up clay from raw ingredients, then do not skimp on this part. Don't skimp on the wedging. Likewise, if you're adding bentonite or other materials that must be fully integrated into the clay body, you're going to want to wedge a lot as well. But if you're just recycling your store-bought or previously prepared clay, you might not need to wedge that much at all. However, the clay will still need to be kneaded. What I do to knead the clay into an even consistency, I begin by folding the clay in half, sort of towards me, and then I push with the heel of my hands to unify the mass together. Then I turn the clay 90 degrees, and I repeat the folding process. So fold, push, turn. You do it about 50 times. By the way, I have actual videos of this at my website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, if you want to see me in action, wedging and kneading my clay. So anyway, after this, I slam the clay down maybe 20 times, rotating the lump after every slam so that it starts to form a rough cube shape, right? So you're just picking up the whole mass, knocking it down, that gives it a flat side, and then you turn it, give it another flat side, you keep on doing it, and you're going to end up with a cube. And at this point, I see a lot of air bubbles that get forced to the surface from the clay, which is great. That's why I'm slamming it down, right? I'm compressing the clay. The clay lays down in nice little layers, extra water gets slammed out, and the clay is in a nice tidy cube ready for bagging. Now at this point, we're done recycling the clay. But the processes of clay, the processes that the clay undergoes, it doesn't end here. The clay will continue to improve in the bag in a couple different ways. Firstly, the clay, if you encourage it, will begin to sour. Now, what is souring? If you have read art histories about sculptors and old sculpture manuals, you'll find a notion that's sometimes repeated that clay gets better with reuse. But it's almost never explained why that happens. Likewise, you'll sometimes come across the studio lore that Auguste Rodin would sometimes add little bits of horse dung into his clay to improve it. And when you read that, there's usually no explanation as to what in the world's going on with that either. Well, these two tidbits of studio lore are actually related to each other. They are both practices which encourage the souring of clay. Now, souring is the intentional encouragement, or at least allowance, of clay to get a little smelly and moldy. We've all kept some open clay in a plastic bag, and then after having it sit around for a while, we go to the bag, open it up, and we're greeted with a nice little musty smell, similar to a damp basement or a garage. Maybe we've encountered that smell after unwrapping a damp cloth from a sculpture after it sat on the shelf for a while. Or maybe you went to use some clay that's been sitting around for a while, and when you scoop out a bit of the lump, you see bluish streaks in the clay underneath the surface. And that bluish color is from the growth of mold. Believe it or not, it's not only not a bad thing to have moldy clay, it is, in fact, a good thing. Soured clay is more highly plastic than unsoured clay. Basically, the bacterial mold that grows in the clay is microscopic, and so it interacts with the clay particles on the same level that water does. The bacteria works its way through the individual particles, kind of pushing them apart, breaking bigger particle clumps into smaller ones, and of course that just encourages plasticity. The bacteria growing through the clay thus opens the structure of the clay and makes it easier for water to pass through, the same way the addition of grog does. Now, the decomposition of organic matter in clay by bacterial action, like Rodin's horse dung, it produces colloidal amino acids. And that is basically a deflocculant like bentonite, meaning you can have a slightly drier and therefore stronger clay, yet with more plasticity and less water. In a nutshell, sour clay can display similar properties of strength and plasticity that grogged or deflocked clay does, but without the rough texture and without the additives. So Rodin, he added tiny bits of horse poop into his clay to give the bacteria something to eat. I've never done this or anything like this. I don't know, maybe it's because I also add vinegar and the bacteria eats the vinegar? I'm not quite sure. I don't know what my sour clay eats to become sour, but whatever it is, it seems to be enough. It could be also maybe cloth fibers or oils from my hands or fibers from my sponges. I don't know. I know a sculptor, though, who read about Rodin's introduction of manure into clay for added workability, and not understanding the chemistry of what was going on, my friend thought that what was desired was rotten material in the clay, that something rotten would make his clay better. So instead of horse dung, which is kind of inconvenient to find these days, my friend threw an entire can of tuna fish into his clay bucket. It did not produce the results he was looking for. So it's virtually effortless to make your clay go sour when you recycle it, right? You just let it sit. But note that when you dry out the clay in order to recycle it, that drying action is going to kill off any of the bacteria you had in that soured clay. So you need to seed your clay bucket with a little bit of sour clay. It's almost like a sourdough starter. In fact, it might be exactly like a sourdough starter. So what I do is this. I have a pail of slip. I have a bucket of slip that I mixed up like 3 years ago. It's totally moldy. It's blue. Now every time I recycle clay, I will add a cup or two of moldy slip into the clay bucket at the same time I add the water and vinegar. And this is enough to seed the clay so that when I've got it all wedged and kneaded and bagged, when I go to use the clay a month or two later, it's going to be nice and stinky. Now if the bluish stains in the clay kind of bug you, don't worry. They disappear after exposure to the air, and it only takes about an hour. So if you're using the blue clay and your figure or portrait might have some blue streaks as you put the clay on, but they fade out probably by the end of the day. Another way clay conditions itself after the recycling process is called aging or maturing. All that is letting the clay sit for several weeks after you've made it before using it. In addition to allowing the clay to sour, the extra time allows any clay particles that haven't aligned themselves the way they should to lie down and behave. Also, the water and the bacteria will work through the larger particles, dividing them into smaller particles, resulting in a more plastic clay. Storing the clay under pressure helps with this as well. So I stack my clay as high as I can to kind of compress the clay that assists with this aging and maturing process. Now keep in mind that you want to store the clay a little on the soft and watery side, because the clay will dry out just a little bit as it sits. And seriously, if you recycle clay, letting the clay sit for a few weeks, or even better, a few months, makes more difference to the workability of clay than anything else we've talked about. And you can immediately feel the difference between newly recycled and mature clay. All right, I think that just about covers it. But if you recycle clay and you do so in a way different from me, or if you have some magic additives that give your clay superpowers beyond imagining, I want to hear about it. We all do. So go to our Facebook group page, The Sculptor's Funeral. You'll find it at Facebook. Give us your recipe, or describe what you do to your clay and what effect it has on its workability. What do you add? Do you add horse dung? Do you add tuna fish? Do you add the blood of virgins, the tears of angels? Whatever you add, I want to hear about it. Tell me what it does. So, the big news I have today is that The Sculptor's Funeral is everywhere. We are on iTunes, as we have been for a couple weeks, but we are also on Stitcher, the place to listen to podcasts for Android or Windows smartphone and tablet users. Stitcher.com. You can download the Stitcher app on your smartphone or your tablet or even on your web-enabled car. And you can listen to The Sculptor's Funeral whenever and wherever you want. Again, I want to thank you all very, very much for listening. Have a good week.